I do not feel like myself anymore, but not in a bad way, and that is confusing me more than the bad years ever did. Someone left exactly that comment on my last video. I keep getting messages that sound just like this. People saying, everyone keeps telling me I have changed. They say it like it is a good thing, but nobody explains what actually changed, and it is making me question if I am actually healed or just numb. Or they say, I stopped feeling guilty for things I used to apologize for constantly. It is a massive relief, but it also scares me a little. Like, who even am I now if I am not the person who always says sorry? The more you try to heal, the more you try to be good, the more you try to be understanding and empathetic, the worse the exhaustion gets. The heavier the burden becomes. There is a reason for this. And it has nothing to do with you not trying hard enough, or not meditating enough, or not being spiritual enough. It has to do with an illusion. An illusion that being an empath means being entirely made of light. And that illusion has a specific origin. It is tearing people apart. But there is a way out, and it looks completely different from what you have been taught to expect. Let us look at what is actually happening. 70% of people who identify as highly empathetic or as empaths report chronic emotional exhaustion. That is according to clinical surveys on compassion fatigue. They are doing everything right. They are listening. They are holding space. They are being the bigger person. And yet, their nervous systems are completely fried. But it gets deeper. When you look at the recovery patterns of people who have survived severe narcissistic abuse, a strange phenomenon emerges. Within the first 2 years of recovery, 68% of survivors report a period of intense emotional flattening. They stop reacting, they stop feeling the high highs and the low lows, and they panic. They think they have lost their empathy. They think the trauma broke them permanently. This is not just a modern internet psychology problem. This pattern of inflation and collapse has been documented for decades, and it happens all over the world. People try to embody pure goodness, pure selflessness, and they end up hollowed out, isolated, and completely alienated from their own vitality. You do the 8 hours of sleep. You read the self-help books. You go to therapy. You set your boundaries. And yet, the underlying feeling of being an imposter in your own life remains. You feel like you are faking the peace. The math simply does not add up. In today's video, I'm going to show you exactly what is happening to you, where this confusion comes from, and why these strange, uncomfortable feelings are not signs that you are failing. I'm going to show you the 7 concrete signs that you have finally integrated your shadow. And at the end, I will show you why the real victory feels less like enlightenment and much more like silence. Before we start, please leave a like on this video and subscribe to the channel. This is incredibly important for the algorithm to understand that this content has real value for you, and it tells the platform that you want to see more videos just like this one. And the signs that you have integrated your shadow do not look like a spiritual victory. They look like you finally stopped needing to prove you are a good person. To understand where this came from, we have to go back to 1951. 1951. Carl Gustav Jung publishes a book called Aion, researches into the phenomenology of the self. In the very first chapter, he lays out a concept that would change psychology forever, but which has been deeply misunderstood ever since. Jung defines the shadow as simply as that which one does not wish to be. It is the repressed psychic content, the anger, the selfishness, the capacity for manipulation, the coldness, the things you decided were unacceptable when you were very young, so you shoved them down into the basement of your mind. But Jung was explicitly clear about something. When the shadow goes unrecognized, it does not just sit quietly in the basement. It gets lived out. It projects itself onto the people around you. You start seeing your own hidden darkness in everybody else. And confronting this, bringing it up into the light, Jung called this a moral achievement. It requires conscious recognition, not elimination. You do not get rid of the shadow. You give it a seat at the table. This is where your life enters the story. You were taught that healing means getting rid of your negative traits. You were taught that being an empath means being a sanctuary for other people, but the human psyche works exactly like a seesaw. The harder you push down on one side, trying to repress your own needs, your own anger, your own capacity for destruction, the more violently the other side flies up and hits you in the face. This is the mechanism. The harder you try to be only light, the denser and more autonomous your shadow becomes, and eventually it takes the wheel. But what happens when you actually do the work? What happens when you stop running? Contemporary clinical psychology, specifically programs like the Meridian University training in Jungian psychology, describe shadow integration not as a sudden flash of enlightenment, but as a 5-stage progression: recognition, acceptance, understanding, integration, and finally, embodiment. Embodiment is the final stage. It is marked by the conscious, healthy expression of previously repressed energy in your daily life. Not just intellectual insight, You actually live differently, so how do you know you have reached this stage? How do you know it is working? And sign number 1. The silence of the trigger. Marie-Louise von Franz, one of Jung's closest collaborators, spent years lecturing on the realization of the shadow. She noted something incredibly practical. As a person matures psychologically, they become softer. Acceptance of reality becomes easier and more natural. But the most concrete, observable sign of integration is the reduction of projection. You stop attributing your disowned qualities to other people. Think about how this works. When your shadow is completely unconscious, every minor slight feels like a massive attack. You are hyper-vigilant. You think everyone is trying to manipulate you or use you or disrespect you. You project your own hidden capacity for manipulation onto everyone you meet, assuming they have the exact same dark motives you are desperately hiding from yourself. It becomes an exhausting way to live. Every conversation is a minefield. Every email is a threat. When you integrate your shadow, the trigger does not disappear, but it loses its electric charge. Someone criticizes you, and instead of a wave of panic or defensive rage, you feel a quiet internal silence. You might even look at them and think, well, they are not entirely wrong. I can be selfish sometimes. I can be difficult. There is no more shame. There is no more guilt. There is no more need to hide your shadow aspects. Because you have already welcomed them, they lose their grip over you. This feels like numbness at first because you are so used to the adrenaline of being triggered. But it is not numbness, it is peace. It is the trigger losing its power to run the show. You see, for years, the empath's nervous system is conditioned to interpret any form of boundary setting as an act of war. When the shadow integrates, that conditioning breaks. You stop needing the other person to be a monster so that you can be the saint. You just see them as a person who is behaving badly, and you see yourself as a person who does not have to tolerate it. The silence of the trigger is the deepest form of freedom you will ever experience. And sign number 2, the end of the inflation and alienation cycle. In 1972, the Jungian analyst Edward Edinger published a book called Ego and Archetype. He described something called the ego-self axis and the cycle of inflation and alienation. This is critical. When your ego identifies with something massive and archetypal, like the archetype of the healer or the empath or the enlightened one, it inflates. You feel grandiose. You feel special. You feel like you carry the weight of the world because you are so uniquely sensitive. You convince yourself that your pain makes you superior to the average unfeeling person walking down the street. That is inflation. But inflation cannot last. Inevitably, you fail. You snap at someone. You feel exhausted. You realize you cannot save everyone, and then the ego splits off and it crashes into alienation. You feel worthless. You feel empty. You feel like a complete fraud. You wonder if everything you thought you knew about yourself was a lie. You swing from being the savior of the world to being the absolute worst person on the planet. Real shadow integration produces neither messianic euphoria nor deep emptiness. It produces an ego that relates to the deep self without being possessed by it. You do not feel like a special, enlightened angel of mercy anymore. You just feel like a human being. A regular, flawed, ordinary human being trying to do their best. If you are feeling less special lately, less like a magical empath, and more like a normal person with limits, you are not losing your gift. You are finally grounding it in reality. You are stepping off the pendulum. This is terrifying for the ego, because the ego loves to be special, even if being special means being especially traumatized. Giving up the identity of the wounded healer is often the most painful part of the process, but it is the only way to actually heal. And in sign number 3, you recognize your own capacity for manipulation. There is a deeply uncomfortable pattern reported by survivors of narcissistic relationships. A writer named Chris Mattis documented this beautifully in an essay about how an empath finally sees their shadow. She wrote about her long recovery from a narcissistic partner. For years she saw him as all the darkness and herself as all the light. She was the absolute victim. He was the absolute perpetrator. That was the clean, simple narrative that kept her safe from having to look at her own reflection. The turning point came when she admitted something terrifying. She admitted that she could manipulate too. She realized that she had gone quiet on purpose. She had used being understanding as a way to control the outcome of arguments without ever having to raise her voice. She had used her empathy as a weapon of moral superiority. She had stayed in the relationship not out of pure love, but because being the good one gave her a sense of power. When you can look at your own past behaviors and say, yes, I did that. I manipulated that situation. I played the victim to get my way. I used my sensitivity as a shield. And you can say this without hating yourself, without spiraling into a shame pit. That is shadow integration. You realize you are capable of all the things you despise in others. And because you know you are capable of them, you no longer have to accidentally act them out. You choose not to. This brings a profound sense of humility. You are no longer standing on a pedestal looking down at the broken people. You are standing on the ground, acknowledging that you carry the exact same seeds of destruction within your own psyche. H. Shortner and sign number 4. The death of the caregiver persona. I spent 12 years working as a grief counselor in hospice care. 12 years sitting with people who were dying, and with the families they were leaving behind. I thought I was doing it because I had so much empathy. I thought I was strong because I could carry all that pain. I wore my exhaustion like a badge of honor. But one afternoon, I was sitting with a patient who was in his final weeks. He was a rough, cynical old guy who did not have much patience for sentimentality. I was doing my usual routine, holding space, speaking in that soft, soothing caregiver voice. He looked at me and said, "You do not have to do that with me. You can just be angry that the world is a mess. You do not have to pretend to be a saint all the time. It must be exhausting." He saw right through me. The burnout that eventually forced me to leave that profession did not come from feeling too much. It came from carrying other people's pain while never, ever admitting my own hidden anger, my own envy, my own coldness behind the caregiver role. I was using their tragedy to avoid looking at my own emptiness. When your shadow is integrated, the compulsive need to rescue other people dies. You can still help. You can still care. But it is a choice, not a compulsion. You no longer need to save others to justify your own existence. The persona of the selfless martyr falls away, and underneath it, you find someone who is allowed to rest. You find someone who can say no, someone who can walk away from a burning building without feeling responsible for the fire. Sign number 5. The absence of euphoria. Marie Stein, a prominent analyst at the Jung Institute of Chicago, talks about the function of the numinous in individuation. When you encounter deep archetypal material, it can feel like a massive spiritual awakening. It feels euphoric, the world looks brighter, you feel deeply connected to everything. But Stein warns that without reality testing, this simply leads to ego inflation. You feel awakened rather than simply more whole. You mistake a psychological event for a permanent state of enlightenment. A Jungian analyst treats shadow integration as a slow, relational, and ethical process, precisely to prevent that inflation. If you are waiting for shadow work to feel like a fireworks display of spiritual enlightenment, you are going to be deeply disappointed. True integration feels remarkably ordinary. It feels like doing the laundry. It feels like paying your bills. It feels like being able to sit in traffic without losing your mind. It does not feel like you are vibrating at a higher frequency. It feels like you are finally living on Earth instead of trying to float above it. The silence you are feeling, the lack of dramatic emotional highs and lows, that is not depression, that is stability, that is the baseline of a healthy psyche. It is the feeling of coming home to a house that is quiet, clean, and completely your own. And sign number 6. Tolerating the ambivalence of your own darkness. You no longer need to be entirely good or entirely bad. You can hold a tension of opposites. You can love someone deeply and simultaneously need to get away from them for a weekend. You can be dedicated to your work and completely resent it on a Tuesday morning. You can be deeply empathetic and absolutely refuse to listen to someone's complaints because you are simply too tired. And here's the key. You can do all of these things without apologizing for your existence. You stop feeling guilty for taking up space. When someone accuses you of being selfish, you do not immediately launch into a 20-minute defense of your character. You do not pull out an Excel spreadsheet of all the good deeds you have done to prove them wrong. You just nod and say, "Yeah, I can be selfish sometimes. I have that in me." The profound relief of no longer having to defend a perfect image of yourself is indescribable. You are free. You are free to be complex, messy, and human. The energy you used to spend managing your reputation, making sure everyone thought you were the nice one, the kind one, the understanding one, all of that energy comes flooding back to you. You can finally use it to actually live your life. End sign number 7. The structural change. Skeptics will often say that shadow work is just repackaged pop psychology. They say that being less reactive or having more self-compassion are vague signs that could describe anyone having a good week. But the difference between a good week and actual shadow integration is durability. It is a structural change in the architecture of your psyche. The trigger still shows up. The difficult person still crosses your path. The stressful situation still happens. But the intensity and the duration of your reaction change consistently over time and across different contexts. It is not a passing mood. It is a permanent shift in how you process reality. It is not just that you hold your tongue when you are angry. It is that the anger itself does not hijack your nervous system anymore. You observe it, you feel it, you decide what to do with it. You are driving the car and the shadow is sitting in the passenger seat. It is allowed to look out the window, it is allowed to pick the music sometimes, but it is no longer grabbing the steering wheel and driving you off a cliff. This structural change is tested under repeated provocation. And you pass the test, not by being perfectly serene, but by being conscious. You catch yourself projecting, you catch yourself wanting to play the victim, and you stop. You choose a different path. Anderson, to truly grasp the magnitude of this shift, we must look deeper into what Marie-Louise von Franz taught about the shadow. She emphasized that not every part of the shadow can or should be integrated. There are elements of absolute archetypal evil that must be cut off, not embraced. This is a critical distinction that modern pop psychology misses. Integration is not about romantically hugging every dark impulse you have. It is about recognizing them so you can choose which ones to civilize and which ones to definitively reject. Think of it like tending a garden. If you pretend there are no weeds, the weeds will take over and destroy the flowers. If you recognize the weeds, you can pull them out. The shadow is the soil, the roots, the unseen underground network. You cannot have the bloom without the dirt. Let us look at another historical example of how projection works on a mass scale. During the witch trials of the 16th and 17th centuries, entire communities became convinced that their neighbors were consorting with the devil. They projected their own repressed sexual desires, their own greed, their own malicious thoughts onto completely innocent people. The shadow, when denied collectively, literally becomes murderous. When you integrate your shadow, you are immunizing yourself against this kind of collective hysteria. You can look at the latest outrage on the internet, the latest villain everyone is attacking, and you can say, yes, they did a terrible thing, but I have the seeds of that exact same terrible thing inside me. This destroys the self-righteousness that fuels mob mentality. And this brings us to a paradox. The more you accept your own capacity for evil, the less likely you are to do evil. The people who commit the most horrific acts are almost always convinced they are doing it for a righteous cause. They are convinced of their own purity. The empath who refuses to look at their own shadow is incredibly dangerous because they will unconsciously manipulate, control, and suffocate the people they claim to be helping, all under the guise of love and care. I saw this constantly in my hospice work. Family members who were so attached to the identity of being the loving, sacrificial caregiver that they completely ignored the actual wishes of the dying person. Their empathy had become a tyranny. They were projecting their own fear of death, their own need for control onto the patient, and because it was dressed up as love, no one could call them out on it. When you finally break this cycle, the relief is profound. You stop needing to be the hero of every story. You stop needing everyone to validate your goodness. You can just be. You can let people be wrong about you. You can let people misunderstand you, because you know who you are. You know your light and you know your dark, and you know they belong together. You are no longer divided against yourself. This is what Carl Jung meant by individuation. It is not becoming perfect, it is becoming whole, and wholeness requires the courage to look at the ugliest parts of yourself without blinking. It requires the humility to accept that you are an animal with instincts, not an angel with wings. The 7 signs we discussed today are milestones on this journey. The silence of the trigger, the end of the inflation and alienation cycle, the recognition of your own manipulative capacity, the death of the caregiver persona, the absence of euphoria, tolerating your own ambivalence, and the structural change in your psyche. If you recognize these signs in yourself, even just a few of them, you are doing the work. You are walking the path. Do not let the silence scare you. Do not let the lack of dramatic emotional highs convince you that you are numb. You are not numb. You are awake. You are finally truly awake. Consider the historical timeline of how we treat sensitivity. For centuries, high sensitivity was viewed as a biological flaw, a weakness of the nerves. Then, in the late 20th century, the pendulum swung the other way. Sensitivity became glorified. The concept of the empath emerged as a kind of spiritual superhero, but both extremes are traps. Viewing yourself as biologically fragile keeps you locked in victimhood. Viewing yourself as a spiritual superhero keeps you locked in inflation. The middle path, the path of shadow integration, demands that you see your sensitivity as a neutral trait. It is a tool, like a finely tuned instrument. If you do not know how to play it, it will just make noise and drive you crazy. If you learn how to play it, it can create something beautiful. But learning to play the instrument requires discipline. It requires facing the parts of yourself that are dissonant, out of tune, and downright ugly. When you start this process, the first thing that usually happens is a period of intense grief. You grieve the loss of your innocence. You grieve the realization that you are not the pure, unblemished victim you thought you were. You grieve the time you lost trying to save people who did not want to be saved, simply because you were using them to avoid your own pain. This grief is necessary. It is the fire that burns away the false persona, and what is left behind is something indestructible. Think about the physical structure of a tree. The branches can only reach as high into the light as the roots reach down into the darkness of the soil. If a tree tries to grow only upwards, without deepening its roots, the first strong wind will knock it over. This is exactly what happens to the unintegrated empath. They reach for the light, they try to be perfectly loving and compassionate, but they have no roots in their own shadow. And so, the first betrayal, the first harsh criticism, the first encounter with real malevolence completely destroys them. When you integrate your shadow, you are growing your roots. You are anchoring yourself in the dark, messy, fertile soil of your own humanity. And from that place of deep anchoring, you can withstand any storm. You can encounter a narcissist and simply walk away without needing to fix them, without needing to prove they are wrong, without letting their toxicity penetrate your core. You become unshakable. Not because you are defended, but because you have nothing left to hide. You have already seen the worst in yourself, so the worst in others no longer terrifies you. This is the ultimate paradox. By embracing your own darkness, you become truly capable of bringing light into the world. Not the blinding, artificial light of the perfectionist, but the warm, steady, realistic light of a whole human being. It is a long road. It is often a lonely road, but it is the only road that leads to true freedom. As we navigate this complex reality, the most important thing to remember is that you are not alone. The fact that you are even asking these questions, the fact that you are sitting here confronting these uncomfortable truths, means you are participating in the evolution of human consciousness. You are doing the work that the previous generations were too terrified to do, and for that you deserve immense respect, not just from others, but from yourself. So the next time you feel that strange silence, that lack of reactivity, that absence of the old familiar drama, do not panic. Do not go looking for a problem to fix. Just sit with it, breathe into it, let it become your new normal. You have spent your whole life fighting a war against yourself. It is time to declare a truce. It is time to lay down your weapons and welcome all the exiled parts of yourself back home. This is the promise of shadow integration. It does not promise you a life free of pain. It does not promise you a life free of conflict. But it promises you a life that is entirely, authentically your own. And in a world that is constantly trying to make you into something else, that is the greatest victory of all. Let us look closely at the math once more. You spend your 20s trying to be perfect. You spend your 30s exhausting yourself for others. By the time you hit your 40s, the math simply does not work anymore. You cannot sustain the energy required to repress half of your personality. The shadow integration is not a luxury. It is a biological and psychological necessity for survival in the second half of life. Jung called this the transition into the afternoon of life. In the morning of life, we build the ego. We build the persona. We figure out how to survive in the world. But in the afternoon of life, the goals must change. If we carry the goals of the morning into the afternoon, we will suffer immense psychological damage. The afternoon of life is about wholeness. It is about integrating everything we discarded in the morning. It is about realizing that the things we threw away in our youth because they were inconvenient or unacceptable to our parents or our society are actually the exact materials we need to build the foundation of our authentic self. Your anger, your selfishness, your capacity to say no, your intolerance for bullshit. These are not character flaws, these are survival tools, and you need them. You need them to navigate a world that will absolutely crush you if you remain entirely soft, entirely open, and entirely giving. The integrated empath is a force of nature, because they have the sensitivity to read a room, to understand the deepest emotional currents of any situation, but they also have the boundaries, the strength, and the capacity for ruthlessness when necessary to protect themselves and those they love. They are the sheepdog, not the sheep. They have the teeth of the wolf, but they choose to use them to protect the flock, not to consume it, and they can only do this because they have acknowledged the wolf inside themselves. Let us break down those 5 stages of shadow integration into concrete, everyday examples so you can see exactly where you are on the map. Stage 1 is recognition. This usually happens in a moment of crisis. You catch yourself doing something you swore you would never do. You yell at your child the exact way your father yelled at you. You manipulate a coworker to get the promotion you wanted. You lie to your partner about something insignificant just to avoid a minor conflict. In the past, you would have immediately rationalized this. You would have said, well, I was just stressed, or they pushed me to it, or it was for their own good. But in the recognition stage, the rationalization fails. You look in the mirror and you say, my God, I did that. That was me. That was my choice. It is a moment of profound humiliation, and it is absolutely necessary. Stage 2 is acceptance. This is where most people get stuck. Recognition is painful, but acceptance requires you to sit in the pain without trying to fix it immediately. You have to accept that this dark capacity is a permanent part of your psychological makeup. It is not a virus you can cure. It is an organ you have to learn to live with. During the acceptance phase, you might feel deeply depressed. You might feel like you are a terrible person. You are mourning the loss of your perfect self-image, but slowly, the depression lifts, and it is replaced by a quiet, sobering humility. You stop judging other people so harshly because you know exactly how easy it is to fall. Stage 3 is understanding. Now that you have accepted the shadow element, you can start to get curious about it. Why do I manipulate when I feel threatened? Why do I use silence as a weapon? What is this part of me trying to protect? You realize that the shadow is not evil for the sake of being evil. It is a primitive defense mechanism. It is the part of you that stepped in to protect you when you were a vulnerable child, using whatever crude tools it had available. Manipulation was a way to stay safe in a chaotic house. Silence was a way to avoid physical punishment. You begin to understand the shadow's logic, and in doing so, you develop a strange kind of compassion for it. Stage 4 is integration. This is where the magic happens. You take the raw energy of the shadow, and you give it a healthy, conscious outlet. For example, the shadow part of you that is aggressive and confrontational. Instead of repressing it until you explode in a rage at your spouse, you integrate it by joining a debate club, or by taking up martial arts, or by finally standing up to your boss and demanding the raise you deserve. You use the aggressive energy, but you direct it consciously. It serves you instead of you serving it, or the shadow part of you that is selfish. Instead of repressing it until you burn out and secretly resent everyone you help, you integrate it by consciously scheduling time that is entirely unapologetically for you. You say no to social events without giving a long, drawn-out excuse. You let yourself be selfish in small, contained ways so that you do not become a resentful martyr in the big ways. And finally, stage 5 is embodiment. This is the state we have been talking about throughout this entire video. The shadow is no longer a separate entity that you have to manage or negotiate with. It is fully woven into the fabric of your personality. You no longer have to think about setting boundaries. You just set them. You no longer have to remind yourself to be authentic. You just are. The energy that you used to spend fighting a civil war inside your own mind is now fully available to you, to create, to build, to love, and to live. This is the ultimate goal. Not perfection. Not endless, glowing empathy, but robust, resilient, unapologetic wholeness. When I look back at my time in hospice, I realized that the patients who died with the most peace were not the ones who had lived perfect, sinless lives. They were the ones who had made peace with their own contradictions. They knew they had loved fiercely, and they knew they had made terrible mistakes. They held both truths simultaneously. They did not die asking for forgiveness from the universe. They died having already forgiven themselves for being human. That is the peace that shadow integration offers you. You do not have to wait until you are on your deathbed to find it. You can start right now, today, by simply looking at the next uncomfortable feeling that arises, and instead of pushing it away, saying to it, "I see you, you belong here too." And as you continue this practice, day after day, year after year, you will find that the world slowly stops being a terrifying place full of monsters and victims. It just becomes a world full of people, and you become one of them. Not above them, not below them. Just right there with them, walking the path, carrying both the light and the dark. And let us dive even deeper into what Edward Edinger meant by the ego-self axis. The self, with a capital Ace, is the totality of the psyche. It contains everything, the light and the dark, the masculine and the feminine, the human and the animal. The ego is just a small center of conscious awareness. When the ego thinks it is the self, when it thinks it possesses all that divine archetypal power, we get inflation. The empath who thinks they can heal the world with their love is suffering from massive inflation. They have confused their small human ego with the archetypal power of the Great Mother or the Divine Healer. The crash into alienation is the psyche's way of correcting this imbalance. The psyche forces the ego to realize its own smallness. It strips away the grandiosity. It plunges the empath into depression, burnout, and profound self-doubt. This is not a malfunction. It is a necessary corrective mechanism. The goal of individuation is to establish a conscious relationship between the ego and the self without confusing the two. You realize that you have access to deep empathy, but you are not empathy itself. You have access to healing energy, but you are not the ultimate healer. You are just the conduit. When you understand this, the pressure completely evaporates. You do not have to save anyone. You just have to be a conscious human being, doing the best you can in the small circle of influence you have. And Marie-Louise von Franz adds another layer to this. She talked about the shadow in dreams. When you are repressing your shadow, it often shows up in your dreams as a hostile figure, a thief, a murderer, an aggressive animal, or a person of the same sex who you deeply despise. As you begin to integrate the shadow, the dream figures change. The hostile attacker becomes a companion. The wild animal becomes a guide. The despised person becomes someone you can have a conversation with. This is the internal mirror of the external process we talked about earlier, where the trigger loses its charge. Your own unconscious stops attacking you because you have finally stopped attacking it. You see, the psyche is a self-regulating system. It only fights you when you are ignoring a crucial part of the whole. When you bring the missing pieces to the table, the psyche relaxes. The civil war ends. This is why the ultimate sign of shadow integration is silence. It is the silence of a battlefield after the treaty has been signed. It is the quiet hum of a machine that is finally running on all its cylinders instead of tearing itself apart. Let us go back to what happened in 1951, when Jung said that the shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality. He meant that facing this is the hardest work you will ever do. It is much easier to point the finger at the narcissists, the toxic people, the broken systems. It is much harder to look in the mirror and say, I am capable of all of it too. And if you think this is just a psychological exercise, look at the world around you. Look at what happens when entire societies project their shadow onto another group. Look at history, look at the wars, the persecutions, the endless cycles of violence. It always starts with a group of people who are absolutely convinced of their own pure, unadulterated goodness and who see all the evil existing in the other. In every place, in every era, the pattern is exactly the same. Unconscious shadow projection leads to destruction. This is not just your personal healing journey. By doing this work, by integrating your own darkness, you are withdrawing your projections from the world. You are taking responsibility for your own piece of the collective human darkness. You are stopping the cycle of transmission. If you have made it this far into the video, you are already in a very small group. The vast majority of people never even realize that the shadow exists as a problem. They simply live out the effects of it, bouncing from drama to drama, conflict to conflict, forever playing the victim, forever convinced that the world is out to get them. You have moved past that. You already know where the patterns come from. You know how the mechanism works. You know what needs to change. The only thing that separates knowing from transforming is action. It is the willingness to actually sit in the silence and let the old, perfect version of yourself die. You do not need to change everything about your life tomorrow morning. You only need to stop accepting the illusion that you must be entirely made of light. The moment you accept your own complexity, your own capacity for darkness, the rest of your life will reorganize itself around that new grounded truth. I will leave it there for today. Take care of yourselves. Tell me in the comments below. Have you experienced this silent phase? That period where you felt like you lost your empathy, but you actually just lost your reactivity? Comment your experience. I read all of them.